I think that Ginger Snaps just has this very sort of human core to it, and it's got this very identifiable female perspective on adolescence and becoming a teenager, and it really kind of I think speaks to a lot of young girls' sort of attitudes of wanting to bust shit up and being mad at their mother and hating other people in school, and it kind of like it's a coming of age movie.
People who aren't horror fans because they think it's going to be exactly the same kind of experience every time. People who are horror fans, especially contemporary horror fans, understand that no, the joy of horror is it's an infinite Pandora's box of madness, and depending on the artist that you shake up and combine and put together with those toys, anything's possible. And it's such a fantastically rich genre that I hope more women make it. And I hope more women distribute it. And I hope, most of all, more women go see it, because it's an unsung hero in not only great cinema, but incredibly subversive ideas.
Well, I suppose early on, I like anyone else, I was shooting my own movies when I was in high school, and I'd made a feature-length video on VHS when I was in high school called The Eye of a Sarek, which was a kind of a Goonies-inspired masterpiece. Yeah. And then I went to film school right out of high school and shot short films, mostly with horror themes. I went to a place called the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology and made a little short film called Children's Day with 2 L's, Kid and a Monster movies. I've always liked horror genre, so. And then I traveled out to Toronto to attend the Canadian Film Centre, and there I made a short film called Half Nelson, which is about a kid who discovers his father is a vampire, and believes that he could be a vampire as well, that it could be a genetic trait.
That was when we started talking about doing a feature, what kind of feature we would do. And John claims that he pitched the idea of Ginger Snaps to me at some point, and he says that I said that was a stupid idea. It's not true at all. He did pitch it to me, and I can't remember what he said. He may have had some version of it that was a stupid idea, but then he came up with a much better idea, and that became the kernel of Ginger Snaps.
Did I change last night? How would the moon kill shit and change back this morning? Huh? No. Did it take a silver bullet to stop that thing? No, it got killed by a fucking truck.
And Ginger Snaps, kind of just was an expansion of my love for horror genre and my sick fun of like putting young people in precarious situations with monsters. It was interesting because I was watching. I rewatched Ginger Snaps this morning, and there's a lot of sequences that I remember, like from riffing on that were literally straight out of Half Nelson and into kind of a feature film sort of. But monsters and horror have always been a fascination. I met Karen in 1995, and she came out. She was at the Film Center with some other friends of mine, Vincenzo Natali and Graham Manson, and her and I started developing this script together based on a story in my brain, which was about 2 sisters that were really tight, weirdo sisters. Then one of them becomes a werewolf.
John's car broke down one weekend when he drove from one city to the other, to mine, to post a short film he was working on. And mutual friends called around and said, we've got a fellow who's stuck here, another filmmaker, who is broke, and it was a long weekend, and the car wasn't going to be ready for a couple of days, so they had put him up on a sofa, and we'd all sort of gotten together to hang out and make sure he was well fed and watered, and that's how I met John. And out of those conversations, we ended up sort of being interested in each other's work. And basically, Ginger Snaps came about because he said to me, I really want to make a teen girl werewolf movie, and I think you should write it.
The goal was to create a werewolf movie that no one had seen before. It was to kind of take what people people's expectations of the genre and then kind of bend them and twist them and really make it something that that was a departure. I really wanted to strip the magic away from the werewolf and create the werewolf as a kind of a biological entity, that the werewolf was a virus that infected the human body. And the body horror of Cronenberg movies was something that I really wanted to infuse in Ginger Snaps, really because I wanted there to be this kind of, I wanted a level of reality to the whole thing. I wanted to kind of, in a weird, strange way, I wanted to believe it. I didn't, that magical part of changing back and forth by the light of the full moon, I just kind of went, yeah, okay. Why don't we talk about that and mention it, because that's people's expectations of the werewolf, and then depart from that completely and go off in a kind of different direction. And so this long, slow transformation became the fabric of the movie.
The original concept was definitely John's, but the characters and what drives so much of the film, it was really Karen Walton that brought those voices to those two girls, which have resonated so well with a big core audience that film has had.
My concern was mostly with Bridget and Ginger, and adolescents in particular, to construct characters that reflected an experience that I felt was more familiar to most young women, including myself. And then with their characters, it was very much about portraying women I understood or who had points of view that I related to. And, I think almost everybody in high school, in hindsight, feels like they were an outlier of some type, and that's basically where it came from. Did I sit down with a special feminist checklist to do all the right things? No. But did I definitely consciously write against what I had seen teenage women portrayed as in horror films? Yes, I did.
I think the feminist point of view for Ginger Snaps really comes out of the two lead characters being sisters, Bridget and Ginger. And what's quite funny, or not funny, but interesting about Ginger Snaps itself is we think the lead character in Ginger Snaps isn't Ginger, it's Bridget. That was our take when we were editing it together. So when scenes start or when scenes end, we tried to focus more on Bridget than Ginger. Even though Ginger is the flamboyant one, it really is Bridget's story. And yes, Ginger goes through the majority of the changes physically, but it's Bridget who, by the end of the film, comes out from underneath her sister's shadow. Now, how this affects feminism, it's that, and one of John and Karen's mandates for the film is that boys don't solve problems. Boys just add problems. So even though they meet Sam, and Sam comes with all these ideas and possible solutions, inevitably he does not solve the problem.
The ancients thought pure metals purified the blood.
They thought leeches did too.
They do.
I knew John kind of socially. I knew Vincenzo and Natalie kind of socially. And I was at a dinner party at John's house about a year before Ginger Snaps, and somebody mentioned a female werewolf movie, and I was like, really? Went over to John, and he completely brushed me off. He was like, oh, we're miles away from that, we're miles away from that. So I kind of forgot about it, and then like a year later, I get a call from, I think, Karen Lee Hall, one of the producers, and she said, we're doing this movie with John's called Ginger Snaps About a Werewolf, and we're interviewing people in town, and we'd like to get a maquette, which is a miniature version of the final creature, from everybody in town, and we're going to pick the one we like the most. And I immediately went, why? Why are you going to, and you're going to pay people for doing this? Because, oh yeah, we're going to pay you all for doing maquettes. I said, why? Because they're all going to end up looking the same. John wants a very specific look for his werewolf. So all you're going to get is 5 models of the same thing from 5 different people. Why don't you just decide who you want to work with based on their past work and their personality and save yourself some money? And they went, okay. Next day I got the job.
I think we probably started on it in 95, 96, and then shot it in 99. So there was probably 2 or 3 years where we wrote. And at that time, really, there was no particularly good werewolf movies to act as kind of guidance, really. The best one was probably American Werewolf in London. There were sort of little good bits about The Howling, but really it was kind of a wasteland. As far as werewolf movies go, they were all bad. And so that's why it was very difficult for us to call it a werewolf film. We didn't even want to call it that, because werewolf, just saying werewolf, had kind of really cheesy connotations. So even in the movie, we try to avoid the word werewolf, you know, like it was like, I remember us just trying to call it lycanthrope, trying to say anything other than werewolf. And so it was really, you know, we just kind of wanted to make something that was unique and that would catch people's attention. And I think the movies that were acting as inspirations weren't werewolf movies. You know, they came from, you know, Carrie, Dead Ringers, The Fly, Heavenly Creatures. They came from other places, the inspirations, that the things that I really liked that were kind of feeding into this movie.
It's so funny because the first time John said, you should write a teenage girl werewolf movie, I, of course, said no, because I thought that was a terrible idea, because I wasn't up on all the horror comings and goings at that time in my life. And I just thought I was like the worst choice possible to write a movie like that. And his argument had always been, well, that's why you should write it, because you don't like what you're seeing, and someone with a point of view on that should maybe drop in and write a movie you would go and see.
No, I'm a huge fan of American Werewolf in London, huge fan of The Werewolf, of The Howling, huge fan of Wolfen, huge fan of basically every werewolf movie that's come before this. It's impossible to not be either inspired or discouraged by what they've done before. So I knew from reading the script that it was a completely different type of werewolf movie, and it really wasn't going to feature the effects in the same way as, say, American Werewolf did. So I was able to already have that in the back of my mind, you know, kind of building the suit. But again, it was the suit itself kind of lent itself to a certain way of filming, which other movies hadn't done. And it was very much about from the girl's point of view. It wasn't about from the werewolf's point of view. And that made it kind of different, I think, from what come before.
You know, whenever I collaborate with a writer, I mean, you're always kind of looking to use each other's strengths. You know, I'm not a writer. I worked with her a lot and very intensively on the script, but I didn't write dialogue. I would read scenes. I would try and jam ideas. We would work on the story together, and I was there to kind of assist and add and bring ideas but you know, so that's, you know, my contributions tend to be, you know, a little bit more directorial. I would come with a little bit more of the horror. She would come with a little more of the dramaturgy and a bit of that sort of that, you know, teen female fuck you kind of attitude.
We'll be our own pack like before. So us be.
I'd rather be dead than be what you are.
We have a pact! Out by 16 or 10 this even together for fucking ever!
The more Karen and I developed the script, I remember the day, because it didn't start this way. We were, you know, talking through ideas. We might have even written some stuff. I remember the day when we kind of had this epiphany that adolescence and girls' bodies and menstrual cycles were related to lunar cycles, to the moons. And that's what completely brought everything into focus. It was like that piece of the puzzle where you go, oh my God, why didn't we see this in the first place? And then we realized nobody's done this. You know, this is still full moons. We're still talking about full moons. We're still talking about women's bodies and menstruation, and it's lunar cycles, right? And I think that's when we kind of hit that little piece, everything kind of, we realized what we were making, and we realized the path that we had to go down.
Ginger Snaps is about self-destruction. It's about buying into something that really isn't good for you and losing yourself in it and becoming a monster, becoming a creature of an untenable, unsustainable lifestyle.
It feels so good, Bridget. It's like touching yourself. You know, every move, right on the fucking dot. And after, see fucking fireworks. supernovas. I'm a goddamn force of nature. I feel like I could do just about anything.
The casting of Ginger Snaps was probably the most complicated casting I've ever been involved in. Part of what had happened is we had sent our script out to a lot of casting directors before we chose who we wanted to go with. And two of them at that time, I think Columbine had just happened, and there had been a couple of other incidents with teenagers and violence. So a couple of these casting directors got in touch with the media after reading our script and then started complaining about this movie. It hadn't yet been made. It was financed at that point. So suddenly it became this news report. There were radio news reports. We were front page of the newspaper complaining about Canadian taxpayer money going into a movie that was promoting teen violence.
And it happened just around the Columbine, so there were some people who were worried that it was too violent. There were some people that were worried that there were teenagers reenacting death scenarios. So the whole Columbine thing flavored the release of the movie and even the making of the movie, because it was teenage girls who are obsessed with death scenarios end up having, you know, a life and death and a very violent experience through Ginger Snaps and the werewolves. Granted, it's such a fantastical movie that it's I don't want to say comic book violence, but it's not real violence. It's a werewolf. I always laugh when I think that if you really think about it, the antagonist, the thing that's scaring the girls the most, the thing that's chasing down Bridget and is going to kill them, being a werewolf, in reality, it can't even open a door.
So casting became very difficult. In fact, we casted most of the movie out of Vancouver. We were essentially blackballed by a lot of casting directors and agents in Toronto. So it made it very challenging. It actually made it difficult to get some of our locations as well. So we ended up having to travel quite far. We went to Vancouver and New York and LA looking for much of our cast. And of course, the two sisters are so crucial, and the relationship between the two of them is so crucial. So it wasn't even a question about finding, you know, the perfect Ginger or the perfect Bridget. We had to find the right Ginger and Bridget together. So we saw a lot of great young actors that we liked for each of the different roles. But then the trick was being a double act, we found this one actress who's quite famous now, who would have been a great Bridget, but she wouldn't have worked with the Ginger we had. And we couldn't find another Ginger that could have worked with her. And then vice versa. We had another actress who would have been a great Ginger, but then we couldn't find somebody who'd be the right sister for her. They had to feel like they could be sisters. So there were some other options. But I will say, nobody seemed to be a better Ginger than the Ginger we ended up with. Catherine really was. She embodied everything that we wanted out of that character. And at the end of the day, Emily, it was hard to imagine anybody could have been a better Emily. We might have found some actresses that were, you know, in the same ballpark as each of them, but not those two together.
I found Emily in Vancouver, and she came in and she had all these things that like I wanted to see from Bridget, you know, and she had the perfect hair and she just kind of got that sort of dry sense of humor. She got it when I said, like, I don't want to see her smile. And when she does smile, it's really forced. You know, she's forcing a smile, and this weird smile when she's around Pamela, because she's trying to get Pamela to like believe that they're not doing weird things down in the basement.
Think you see werewolves a lot?
Why, do you?
So I read her once in Vancouver, thought she was fantastic, and then I remember we went off and did a bit more casting, and we came back and we're like, well, let's call her back. We want to see her again. She came back, no hair. She'd shaved off her hair. And she was, in my brain, the front runner for the part, and she'd shaved it like this long. And I was like, oh my God, this is the worst possible thing that could happen. And there was no one better than her. There absolutely wasn't. And so we just wound up committed to sticking her in a wig. Like I couldn't have her in this hair. I had to have this image of the gothic sort of arty girl that I kind of had in my brain. So unfortunately we wound up with the wig.
This is a very exciting, confusing time for your sister. Boys, her body, trying to fit in. Maybe if she felt that she could share more with you, you'd both be a lot happier. You know, Bridget, your turn's coming too. One day.
I think as a kid, I just felt really at home in the horror genre. And, you know, as an adult, I really reflected about why that is. And I think it has something to do with the fact that my parents really used fear as a parenting strategy. So they thought that, you know, fear is your friend. And if you're afraid, then you won't do things that are stupid and get yourself hurt. So they were always like warning us about the dangers of the world. And I was a bit obsessed with things like fire or being kidnapped. I remember like Clifford Olson was like, you know, he kidnapped and murdered children in the Lower Mainland when I was a kid, and my parents were always like talking about this. And so, you know, when I got the job in It, that's what it was like. Kids were being kidnapped and murdered, and to me that just felt like reality. Like that's just the world. So yeah, I used to lie at night and like obsess about fire and stuff like that. So it wasn't really hard for me to make that leap into, you know, the imaginative world of the horror genre.
It's funny, when I was a kid, like a young kid, I had this recurring nightmare where I was chased around my block by werewolves. And so when I got into watching horror movies, I don't know if it was subconscious or not, but I kind of stayed away from werewolf movies. So it is a bit funny that my first horror movie is, you know, being chased by werewolves. It's kind of fitting.
Come and get some candy.
It was not hard for me at all to relate to Bridget. When I was a teenager, I constantly thought that, you know, there was something wrong with my body. Like I always felt like it was in excess in some places and deficient in other places. And I also remember feeling like really powerless in my body and feeling very critical of the larger culture that I was part of and that I was expected to become an adult in and be a participating member in. And I really felt that perhaps success in a culture that I felt was corrupt would then mean that I was corrupt, you know. So I really wanted to resist adulthood in a way that I think Bridget does as well.
Ginger and Bridget were such strong female characters, so I, you know, figured I needed to be a strong character as well in Jason's way, which is kind of, you know, that high school jock kind of douchebaggy kind of a thing that he does. And it's interesting, like Jason and his friends, they kind of had this pack mentality, and they were kind of predatory, you know? And so it was like Ginger was already kind of facing these wolves before the actual wolf showed up.
Get up! Come on, get up!
With Catherine, I saw a bunch of girls, and she was just the right amount of sexy, edgy, you know, attitude that like was supposed to be Ginger. Ginger was the protector, right? And Ginger is the older one, and she's the one that is kind of she's looked after Bridget all this time, and Catherine just had all those right things of like wanting her to be like where you're like, you know, one of the things I really wanted to do with Ginger is not only did I want the attitude and the edge and this belief that she could actually hurt you, but I really wanted to create this monster as kind of a beautiful repulsive you know, like I wanted to be completely drawn to her as, you know, if you're a male audience member, I wanted to be going, oh my God, she's really hot. But at the same time being absolutely terrified to put your hands on her, right? So that was, you know, like that something bad would really happen, but you're still drawn to the bait. And that was something that I think Catherine did really, really well.
I think Katie and I, right away, we sort of had this connection. We'd had it actually since childhood. We'd known each other since childhood. We'd been at the same school, where there's 5 years difference in age, but we'd always been at the same schools in all different parts of the Lower Mainland. We had the same agent. And so it just felt like we'd always had this sort of, I don't know, astrological connection. It was very mystical. But our personalities are quite different in some ways. I remember at the time, like I was into my whole women's studies thing, and I was always reading, and she was really into like the hip hop subculture. And in our own different ways, we were really rebels. Like we were really critical of mainstream culture, and in that way we connected. But hers was this very like extroverted, like big personality kind of take on rebellion, and mine was this very inward one. And so we really, like our energies coming together just really worked.
Now I'm you know, best friends with Katie, and I've worked with Chris again and with Emily again, so I know them all quite well now. But at the time, I was nervous. I was, you know, walking onto set with those guys, because they were all really, really talented, and I wanted to kind of step up to the plate, you know what I mean? So it was a bit nerve-wracking, but they were so cool. They were so, again, welcoming and not pretentious at all. There was no egos on set, you know what I mean? They accepted me immediately, and it was just kind of that vibe of, I think we all knew that we were doing something different and something great, and everyone was just excited to be a part of it.
I really enjoyed working with some of the male actors as well, partly because like the guys typically on a set are sort of the main characters. And in this case, you could feel like male actors, especially at that age, they kind of have an ego, right? And you sort of felt like this hesitation, like what's going on here? It's not about us, it's about these like two girls. And they were kind of subdued. And whereas normally I could tell they were the kind of people who would be like really out there and like talking nonstop. But when they would be around Katie and I, they were kind of like, like they wouldn't say too much, and they really sort of sensed that we were the ones that had the power in this situation. So that was really fun.
I think the scene where I grab Emily and kind of drag her into the closet, that was a hard scene to do, because we were, you know, shooting in this just tiny little closet, and it was an intense scene for me. It was, you know, my character was, you know, losing his mind, trying to deal with what was going on, you know, physically and mentally, and it was an emotionally and mentally challenging scene for me. And then the other scene would be the scene with Katie in the back of the car. That was not so much hard, but it was a bit scary for me.
Who's the guy?
Who's the guy here? Huh? Who's the fucking guy here?
Don't we need protection here? Ah, stop it! Wait a second.
You're fucking hilarious, cave boy.
I believe there was a shot of whiskey before that scene. That's something I seem to remember. No, me and Katie, we laugh about it now, you know, because she keeps saying she took my on-screen virginity in that scene. But at the time, we were both nervous about it, you know, and we were kind of like, all right, so I'm going to put my hand here, and you can kiss me here, and then we'll do this and that, try to really map it out. But then, you know, once the cameras roll, it all goes out the window, and it's a free-for-all.
I think, you know, it's always the case that when you begin a project, those first few scenes when you're just trying to establish the character are very difficult. And I sort of wanted to create almost like an inauthentic layer around Bridget, because she's someone who hasn't found herself yet. She doesn't have this confident identity. And so those first scenes that we shot, like I couldn't just be sort of natural and relaxed, because she isn't that way. She's quite guarded, and for her, like, adolescence is really a performance and trying to find out who she is. So trying to find that balance for me was being authentic in that character, but at the same time having that layer, that adolescents have that kind of attitude or whatever that's not truly who they are, who they're going to become. So so it was a struggle for me in those first few days of filming.
A lot of pressure on both Catherine and Emily, because they were throughout the whole movie. It was demanding. It was a low-budget film, so it was shot outside, nighttime, cold weather, long hours. It was a tough movie, but they were both very professional and worked very hard.
I actually love doing action sequences and really getting to be physical, because I think as an actress that's really my weakness, is that I'm very almost cerebral in my approach to character development. Like I think about the psychology of the character, but I don't necessarily think too much about the physical presence of the character, which is really a flaw. And so when I'm doing action sequences, it sort of forces me to become physical.
Yeah, I guess you could say I did my own stunts. That scene at the end, in the party scene, when Mimi Rogers kind of cracks me with that Tupperware container, that was not fake. She smashed me in the face. A direct hit. I didn't get any extra stunt pay though, so I don't know what that's all about.
Mimi Rogers was a really fascinating actress to work with. She kept sort of saying things that were in character when I wasn't expecting it, and it kind of took me off guard. Like, she had sort of developed this idea that the relationship between the mom and the girls was like a little bit abusive, perhaps. So she would kind of like whisper these like random things that were kind of negative, like, and I'd say, oh, did she really mean that? Okay, no, she's just in character. But it really worked, like subconsciously, because then when we were in scenes together, we would kind of look at her like not knowing, like she was an alien almost, like, who are you? I don't know what to expect from you. But it sort of prevented us almost from being comfortable around each other, which wouldn't have been right for the scenes. Like, it was right for us to sort of have this distance between us. So I thought she was really clever in doing that.
And Mimi's such a sweet lady. Like, she's such a cool woman. And she really kind of, I wasn't sure whether, I didn't know her, she's Mimi Rogers, right? And she's married to Tom Cruise at one point. And, she's sort of famous. And I wasn't sure if she was going to kind of get what I was trying to do, or whether she was going to go for it, and Mimi went for it, right? Like, a lot of that wardrobe, Mimi picked herself. Like the Scotty Dog sort of bits of wardrobe and little Scotty Dogs and dangly pumpkin earrings, and Mimi just kind of went, we're going to do this, let's go for it. And just made it hilarious, Like, I think one of my most fun experiences on set with Mimi was the discovery of the soiled underwear in the laundry tub, and there's this moment where we're shooting it, and she pulls it out and she looks at it, and concerned mother look, and Mimi comes up to me after a take or two, and she goes, I just want to try. You kind of got that. I kind of want to try something. Is that okay? And I went, yeah, sure. And she like pulls out the underwear, and there's this like long moment, and then she reaches for the spray and wash and like squirts it. And that was all Mimi. That was not scripted. And she just got it, right? She got the humor. She got the kind of the idiocy of the suburban mom, and that is part of the signature, I think, of Ginger Snaps. That kind of that weird humor, weird suburban humor that sits in there, mixed with kind of visceral horror, and that's sort of what that movie always was meant to be.
I'm sure it seems like a lot of blood. It's a period.
Mimi has this really heartfelt scene where she like has figured out what's going on and chases down Bridget on her way to the Halloween party and picks her up and goes, get in the car, and she's got the fingers. And Mimi's figured it out. Pamela's figured it out. And they pull up into the parking lot of the Halloween party, and there's this very, like, heartfelt scene between Pamela and Bridget where she says, I'm responsible. I'm responsible for this. They're just going to blame me. They always do. And Bridget says, this isn't your fault. And she says, this isn't your fault, Mom. And Pamela says, yes, it is. She's really like, and you know what? It kind of is in a weird way. Like, people always blame the parents. Like, if you're a kid, you got a young 14, 15, 16-year-old kid that goes off and kills a bunch of people, aren't you kind of looking at the parents a little bit? I mean, I don't think it's Pamela's fault, but I do sympathize with her.
It's one thing if you leave. It's almost normal, but no one's gonna take you from me. First thing tomorrow, I'll let the house fill up with gas and I'll light a match.
What?
We'll start fresh, just as girls. It'll be fun.
What about Dad?
He'll just blame me. They all will.
And it was really a journey, and it was hard. We worked a lot of long hours, and by the end, we all got sick. We were all coming down with something. I mean, it was interesting because in the final days, of course, I didn't shoot the movie in sequence, but I shot everything up until the finale. And there's a reason for that because, I'd shot all the interiors. We had a set for the upper floor of the house and then a different set for the lower floor of the house, the basement. And we had to then, for the finale, we had to turn it all around because the house had to get trashed. Because the monster had to come in, and the monster comes in and trashes the house because the monster runs around in the house and destroys a bunch of shit. And then eats Sam and drags him down into the basement. And we had to really... everything else that had to be done with the set had to be done before that. So really, we shot the whole movie and then kind of came at that finale and started it in sequence. So we started, with them coming into the house from the garage and traipsing through and going into the pantry. And Sam, there's a very scary sequence in the pantry where Sam gets attacked and dragged out and eaten. And then Bridget picks up the monk's hood and follows the blood trail down into the basement. And this sort of thing, we shot it all in order. We just would move through it all in order, which ended with Emily and the monster at the end of the movie. And in fact, the very last shot I did was the last shot of the movie. And at that time, Katie was gone, and I wasn't working with her anymore. It was just me and Emily through that whole last sequence. And Emily and this guy in a rubber suit.
I'm not dying!
Back when we shot the first Ginger Snaps, there was no debate. There was no way to do it digitally. Nowadays, if you were making that movie, people would definitely have that debate, and they would probably still, if they're smart, I think, go mostly practically, but at least they would have the option to go digital. Back when we shot that movie, there was no option. Digital effects were incredibly expensive, and practical effects were the only way to do it.
With Ginger Snaps, I felt like it was important to kind of do this old school. It just wanted to be old school. All the werewolf transformation movies and stuff that I'd seen, it had always been old, like American Werewolf in London. I thought had been done really well. And really, those kinds of movies, to me, always sort of function best in the less you see, the scarier it is.
He'd had designs from 2 years previous that actually Vincenzo had worked on as well. He had some designs of the werewolf, and he was very specific about what he wanted. He goes, I want a werewolf with no fur. And I was like, wow, that's new. It's tough to do as well, because it was a four-legged werewolf. It was on all fours, and it had a very long, skinny body. So I immediately thought of doing a puppet, but they nixed that idea right away because it just wasn't practical the way they were going to shoot it. So I was like, well, if you do a guy in a suit, you're kind of limited. So they brought in a stunt guy, and he ended up doing a good job. But I always try and steer away from stunt guys in suits because they always tend to not act. They just smash through things, and there's no kind of nuance in their performance. But the guy we got actually did a pretty good job. But again, it was the biggest problem with the suit for me, from a technical point of view, was it had no fur. Whenever you think of werewolves, you think they're covered in fur. So you can hide zips and snaps and connectors and all the kind of stuff that you need to put a suit on. It's never one piece. So we ended up making the Ginger suit as 2 pieces. It was an entire full body with legs and everything attached, and then a separate head that would snap on. And the only reason the Ginger suit actually has hair is because I glued it on, didn't tell John. And then when we turned up on set, he's like, there's hair on it. What the hell? And I goes, John, I need some hair. We have zips on it that I have to hide. And we can't glue it in because the guy's going to suffocate. We have to have some kind of holes in the suit. So I said, listen, when it's all slicked up and it's all very wet, because John also, he wanted it very kind of feverish and very sickly looking. So we just covered it in a lot of sweat and a lot of goo. And as soon as you wet down all the hair, it goes very slick against the body anyway.
I had actually had some experience previously in prosthetics. When I was in an episode of The X-Files, I had to have like a full head cast taken, and I had to have fake fingers and toes and stuff put on. But I really enjoy that stuff. I absolutely love it. It's so much fun, like as an actor, to be completely transformed physically. When you just look in the mirror and it's a completely different person looking out at you, it's really magical.
It was my first film with prosthetics, yeah, and basically, yeah, and practical effects. It was impressive to see just how good these guys were, you know. And I was lucky; I didn't have to sit in the chair that long. I had a bit of stuff on, but I mean, Katie was in the chair for hours and hours and hours every day. You know what I mean? I think it was 6 hours to put that thing on, or something like that. And you know, it takes a lot of focus to sit there while you're preparing for your day, go out and do your day, and then have to do it all again at the end to take it off. You know, it's really hard to do.
There was a couple of other scenes in the movie involving Ginger's transformation, and that was at first very subtle. We made very subtle teeth for her, and we made these kind of eye pieces to make it look like her eye socket was changing. Again, this was in the days when everything was foam latex. So there's certain shots that I still cringe at now, only because now you would do it in silicone and it would just photograph so much better. But at the time we were using foam, so it was a little bit flat. It was fun working with Catherine because she'd never worn that much prosthetics before. And she came into the movie not realizing she was going to wear that much transformation. She thought it was going to be her, it was going to be her, it was going to be her, then it was going to be a werewolf. But she didn't realize there was going to be makeup on her. So she wasn't a huge fan of the makeup, but she's a pro. She sat in the chair and she let me do my work. But there was a fun day where we were doing this. She comes into the Halloween party and she's kind of almost transformed as far as she was going to transform. But she had a full prosthetic chest where we gave her new foam latex breasts and extra nipples going down her stomach. And it was supposed to be essentially a topless scene, but she didn't want to be topless, even though it was foam latex. There was none of her skin showing whatsoever. So it was kind of fun. We had to strategically put like toupee tape to hold her shirt at a certain angle, so it looked like she was topless and naked, but she actually wasn't. So even though it was rubber nipples, she still didn't want them on camera. So that was kind of funny. I think it was about 8 weeks, and 2 of those weeks were during shooting. So we didn't shoot the werewolf right away. That was shot in the last week of filming. So we were still building it while we were going on set doing some of Ginger's transformation stuff and the tail and some of the gore stuff. Yeah, it was about 8 weeks, and my crew was quite small at the time because Toronto was quite busy. Toronto as a town is a very, very busy town, but there isn't a huge amount of makeup effects guys here. So when there's a lot of work, you're kind of limited to who you can hire because everybody kind of has their own shows. So on other movies I've done, I've had everybody in town working on it, and on Ginger Snaps, I end up bringing people in from England.
As much fear as I had about a dude in a rubber suit, because that's what it was. It was a guy in a rubber suit, essentially, with some remote controls and that sort of thing. As much fear as I had about that, that fear was alleviated by the end of the movie when that big rubber thing is lying on the ground and Bridget has tears running down her face, and I just realized in that moment in shooting with Emily, you know, when you know, right at the end of the schedule, second last shot of the movie, she's got tears running down her face. I realized it didn't matter because the emotion that shows on her, the journey that we've been through, and that her face, streaming tears, was everything that sold all of that, all of the, it sold, that sells everything. It didn't matter at that point if the makeup was unbelievably great or unbelievably bad. It's what mattered was the sort of heart and soul of those characters, and that really, I was so moved when we shot that sequence with Emily and what she did there, and I just realized all my fears about the rubber suit and the makeup effects and all that stuff were just alleviated because I realized it didn't matter anymore.
Yeah, the discussions earlier on about the suit were quite important because the suit is white. It's essentially, I mean, John wanted it literally albino with no hair on it, which is a big departure from how werewolves have been done before. They've always been very dark and very furry, and you can put them in a shadow and it's just their eyes and their teeth you see. With this guy, or this girl, it's very tricky because even the smallest amount of light, you see this damn thing. So it ended up being a lot of sound effects and things like that in the way it was positioned. But as far as lighting went, yeah, I didn't have any input as such. It was 14 years ago, so now I have a lot more say when I get to set. But it was still, I hadn't worked with John, I hadn't worked with DP before. So, but when you cover something in slime, that helps a lot. You can kind of bounce light off and everything. And we kind of obscured it with objects in the basement, so there was shelving and chairs and things like that. But yeah, it was a tough thing to shoot from their point of view. Getting the suit on set and getting it working was actually easy. The funny thing was he had leg extensions, so the stunt guy could hold his own position. It was like full feet and arm leg extensions, but he could balance quite well and he could take a couple of steps. But I knew he couldn't run in it, so we had a wire rig that was rigged, a very rudimentary thing that Shelley, the stunt coordinator, would rig, so he could actually jump onto tables and things like that for quick shots. That worked pretty well. The funny thing was John loved the suit. So we got to set, and he shot the shit out of it. And I'm like, and I kept going over, said, John, you know you're not going to use half of this stuff. And he goes, no, it looks great, it looks great. So he just kept shooting it. And I heard from when they got to the editing process, I said to him, because I was joking with him one day, and I said, so how much of the suit stayed in the movie? And he went, not much. He said, just what I needed, but yeah, you were right. You can't overshoot monster suits. It's like you just don't do it. It's more about POV and about suggestion and shadow, and you cut to quick shots of it because at the end of the day, it's not real, no matter how the audience is wrapped up in it. It's a rubber suit.
So we built the monster, and we had very elaborate plans for what we were going to do with it. And in the end, I ended up cutting a whole ton of stuff out. In fact, in rewatching it now in 2014, I feel like there's actually stuff that I left in that I should have cut out. I should have showed even less. But yeah, there was a lot of stuff that got shot that I cut because some of it was dodgy. But for the most part, I just realized, using sound effects and just showing little bits and pieces worked better.
The editing of the picture, because they had this script that they had developed for such a long time, and it was honed to this great little gem of a story that was very compact and tight. Unfortunately, the film and the script that they wrote ended up coming in a little long. Having all the content that they wrote in that script on the screen would have been more than 2 hours, maybe even longer. So during the editing process, we had to make some decisions to trim some of the excess stuff that didn't quite belong to tell an efficient story that John and Karen wanted to tell. There was even a point where we were at, I think it was like 93 minutes or something, and we had to get it down to 91 minutes, and it was like, we have to lose 2 more minutes. And we had tried for weeks to get it as tight as possible, trying all the various permutations we could to lose those last final minutes. And what's interesting is we decided over the course of the weekend we would leave, but the assistant editor stayed, and the assistant editor took 1 frame off the head of every shot and 1 frame off the tail of every shot. Then we came back in on Monday after that had been done, and we'd lost probably 2.5 minutes or something. And it worked great, except for certain scenes that were action scenes or scenes that were very specific, that were cut frame accurate. precise. But other than that, that picked the pace up of the film, and it just made an overall increase in, I guess, tension and fun, and just made the film move much faster for us.
We essentially shot the script as planned with two things that I remember in particular that changed. One was the language. It was one of these situations where it was already some bad language in the movie, and at the time we were shooting this, it wasn't quite the way it is nowadays, where the language is quite as raw as it is. But because there was some raw language in it, it just became one of these things where the actors just kept throwing the F word in all the time, to the point where it actually became an issue. Looking at dailies, talking about with distributors, saying, we've got to stop this, it's just every second word. So that was one thing, and as a producer, I learned a lesson there about letting cast and directors kind of go off script, and how it can become kind of a crutch, and then you find yourself in the edit room and realize, oh, that's not really the tone we wanted. So that did happen. In fact, we did have to kind of fight that in the edit room a little bit. I think it was part of because everyone involved was so young at the time, and so once an actor says fuck, then they all start saying it. And then the other thing that changed, we had a scene that was planned after Ginger is killed by Bridget in the basement. And it was a scene that involved Bridget leaving town and burning down the house. And we just didn't have the money for that scene, but it was in the script, and so it was planned to be done. And I remember I'd always felt the movie's over. I mean, what you want to do is you want this great pull back, which was always planned, of Bridget over the body of her sister, and then the movie's over. So that was my argument all the way through the pre-production of the film, that we just didn't need to see it, that in fact it was the wrong note to end on. And then on top of that, it was so hard because of the limited resources we had. At the end of the day, while we started shooting the film and assembling it, that's when it became clear to everybody, yeah, you know what, we didn't need to shoot this.
There were much more elaborate sequences around the Halloween party, and Bridget infecting herself. There's a Sam-Ginger confrontation in his room at the back of the party, and Bridget shows up and breaks that up and ends up infecting herself. And there used to be a version, like there was a bigger Hollywood version in there, where we were imagining that we had this giant budget. And I seem to recall there was a confrontation at the Halloween party in the original stories where we were doing a high fall, like Bridget fell off something and mortally wounded herself in a confrontation with Ginger, and trying to kind of remove Sam, split this up, and Ginger kind of attacked her because Ginger's kind of a little messed up now, and is down the road in terms of she's already killed the janitor at the school, and so she accidentally mortally wounds Bridget. And that sequence, the way I remember it in the first scripts, was that Bridget had to infect herself to save her own life. So it was, because I think she was impaled. She'd fallen off something and was impaled, and and was bleeding, and so Ginger kind of came over and she infected herself to save herself, which is a pretty cool way to do it. We just couldn't afford it, and in the final version, Bridget really just makes the decision to infect herself to try and lure Ginger back to the house. And so it became a much simpler version. And there were places like that where we just had to go, and we had, less time than we would have liked to shoot the movie. I mean, things change as you kind of move from a script into the reality of shooting, and how much time you've got and how much you can afford to do and how good are the effects and that sort of thing. So any movie sort of goes through those sorts of phases, and I think for the most part, though, we did what we wanted to do. We set out to do. We had a script that we really liked, and we shot it. And Steve and I I remember in the final weeks of shooting that movie, Steve and I were going, we don't have enough money to finish. And him and I making a little pact together, putting our own money into the movie to try and just get it done.
So let's just forget the Hollywood rules.
Scoring for a horror film is quite a bit different than scoring other films. I've done 20 other films now, and I find the horror stuff really challenging because there's so many cliches that you can do. There's so many, the big Herman strings or the John Williams Jaws stuff. There's there's so in this one we just kind of pulled out all the tricks because it was sort of my first real movie. So we tried a wide range of things, and for the most part they worked.
Mom. What? What do guys want?
I'm a fan of horror films because I'm terrified by them, like actual chicken in the theater. I'm not very good at it. And so I think it comes across in the music because my desk when I was writing it was facing the door. It wasn't facing away from the door, so people would come into to my little writing room and go, "You should see your face right now." I was like, this is grossing me out. And I was on set and I saw all the stuff and I know the process, but I was like legitimately, kind of freaked out by it. So I think it comes across in, some of the tension moments and things like that when things are really happening. I was like, this is gross. This is before Twilight, before all those other young people become other things movies, and it was a new sort of take on it. It was more about, well, the alignment was that our bodies are changing and we're kind of transforming into something else at that age, and so there was that sort of parallel that was going on. So we brought a lot of young, edgy stuff to the score. And I remember being a kid and watching horror and knowing exactly when I needed to pull my knees up and kind of hide or look back at the projector or something because something bad was going to happen. Even pre-horror when you're watching Disney when you're a kid and Pinocchio's going through some bad stuff and you go, oh, okay, I know what's happening now. And it actually makes it worse when you don't watch because if you close your eyes, the music is quite dissonant and quite disturbing, and so your imagination can go to really bad places. It was great working with John on like a major piece because we'd always just done these little student films and short films and commercials and things like that before, and we never got a chance to really break down scenes and think. John basically taught me what to do on this movie. I was, as I said before, I was pretty green, and so I might have been in a bit over my head, and he came out. We were working across the country and sending things back and forth and comments and cues and things like that, and he came out and just sort of broke things down for me and really taught me a lot. And we did a couple films after that, and I've always been grateful to John for basically being a mentor and a teacher.
It was the beginnings of all of our careers. It was really the beginning of my career and Katie's and Emily's. It was really like a formative sort of experience.
Ginger Snaps, I'm sure, is going to be that film that I always look back to. It was at a key point in my career where if it didn't go so well, and by that I mean creatively, because of course we didn't get the big release that we were hoping for, but it just turned out creatively so well, and it's such a strong movie that so many people still respond to, that I'm glad it happened when it did in my career. It certainly informed where we went from there. If it hadn't been for that success, maybe I would have veered out of genre film into some other direction.
The initial release of the film was crazy, especially for here, because it was an independent film, and it's a gamble from beginning to end when you make a little tiny film without a super distributor, massive entity behind you, distributing worldwide, all that kind of stuff. So the reception to the film when it first opened, I actually debuted at the Toronto International Film Festival, was phenomenal. It was my first film, remember, so I had never seen anything like the reaction to this, and the audience was so diverse, and there were so many women who were so excited after. I'd never seen that before either, but I was the new guy, so if there's a context for that and I didn't get it, but my experience certainly was being pretty much blown away. I thought we were just, making a cool little monster movie, and people who love monster movies would find it somehow, and that's all I expected. But the reaction instead was pretty overwhelming. It was pretty cool.
When I first saw the film, I was like, who is that person? I didn't even really recognize myself. Partly because I was wearing a wig in it, but it didn't, it wasn't the way I normally dress in my usual life. And sort of seeing the whole film put together, it was really, it was a complete world. And it was so, you know, I think John Fawcett just did a wonderful job in directing and creating this, you know, this world of Bridget and Ginger. So I felt this sort of distance between, you know, the experience of making the film and then the actual product. There's always a distance there, I guess.
At the Toronto Film Festival, it did create a buzz, and it reviewed well, and we were excited about it. In fact, we came very close to selling it to Fox Searchlight, and we had a meeting at Fox Searchlight. The goal was to make a U.S. sale, and we had a meeting there, and with the Fox Searchlight guys, and at which point they said, well, we need to remove most of the language from the movie. So, and I don't know if you've noticed, but the word "fuck" gets used about 500 times through the course of the movie. I was like, "Huh? We're going to remove the language?" And then there were a bunch of things that they just wanted to tone down because they didn't want an R rating. They wanted a PG they wanted teenage. They assumed that if the protagonists were 16-year-olds, that the audience should be 16-year-olds, and we just kind of went, no, how do we do that? That's not what this is. And so we ended up walking away from Fox Searchlight and had no U.S. distributor. Well, then we wound up with whoever we wound up distributing it in the States, just kind of put it out on DVD, and it never went into theaters in the United States. And it was very, very disappointing. It didn't do well box office-wise in Canada. It came and went. They, you know, much as our Canadian distributor loved it at the time and were really excited about it, they put it out the first week of May, and 2 weeks later, Mummy Returns came out and trounced it, and it was gone. So, not many people saw it in the theaters either. And it had become another thing where it was like, oh, I made this great movie and no one's going to see it. It's going to fall through the cracks like everything else I've ever made. And then I got a call at home from some guy, and you know what? I can't even remember his name now. But he had a rep theater in New York City, and he'd seen the movie at the Toronto Film Festival. He called me and he said, "Hey, we really want to show this. Who's your U.S. distributor? Can I get a print of it?" And I said, you know, if you're never going to get a print out of our U.S. distributor. I don't think they even own a print. Why don't I just said, like, if you want to show it, and you wanted to show it in the week before Halloween, I'll give you my print. If you pay for the shipping costs, you can have it for free. I don't care. Keep all the money. Just show it, for the love of God. And so he did, and I just forgot about it. I sent the print off, and I forgot all about it. And then I got a call from my agent on a Monday, and he said, "Oh my God, you have to see the cover of the entertainment section of the New York Times." And I looked, and it was a half-page article that Elvis Mitchell had written on Ginger Snaps, this unbelievable review that he had written on Ginger Snaps, because he'd seen it at this rep theater and had seen it at the film festival. And suddenly, this little movie that had kind of just pretty much disappeared, by the end of that week, HBO had bought it. And HBO played the shit out of it. And that's how people, I mean, that was really a massive part of what created the cult success of Ginger Snaps, was HBO buying the movie and playing it endlessly. They played it tons. And we got more people saw it on HBO than ever would have seen it, even with a theatrical release in the United States. And so that sort of, you know, got the engines going, and we had pretty good success in the UK, and, you know, but in Canada, it just kind of...
It was, again, it was a bold vision by John and Karen, and they went for it. I think it was way ahead of its time when it first came out, and I think people didn't really understand what they were trying to do. They thought it was kind of a you know, cool horror movie from Canada, but they didn't understand the tone or the actual points they were trying to make and the actual story they were trying to tell until many years later. And I think it compares. I think it rates really highly next to any other werewolf out there, and I think it fits into the genre really well. So the fact I got to build a big rubber suit for it, I'm pretty proud of that.
In my experience, Ginger Snaps was completely unique in terms of that team starting from scratch, building it together, going to camera and getting the financing, but going to camera as with everybody on board and up to speed and supporting each other and signed off on exactly what we wanted to make. That has been unique in my experience.
To me, Ginger Snaps just represents this very specific time in my life. You know, a place where I was, as a young filmmaker, I was trying to kind of, just trying to kind of make an impression. And really, it was just born of fits and passion and a love for cinema. It really was, so it was just a lot of. I just remember a lot of hard work, and my life just completely revolved around that script and that movie for 2 or 3 years, and so it really is. When I look back at that, it really is like looking back at this very specific snapshot, this time period in my life that lasted for 2 or 3 years, and so it was interesting watching it again and sort of remembering what it was like, you know.
Is there a wall of tampons? Yes. In Canada, we have great walls of tampons.
This one comes with a free calendar.